Chapter 3. Runaway. The holidays had come and gone without much event. The air was becoming cold and frigid. I remembered the winter in New Jersey. I was built late in the year, and winter came to Paterson before I was shipped out. Even so, I had quickly become accustomed to the warm Georgia climate. Senator, who had been built early in '56 and had only experienced Georgia's summer, was finding it hard to deal with. "My dear little brother," Governor told him one day, "the winter of '55 was even colder. This is nothing. I remember the temperature would be below zero and my cylinders would freeze. You're just too young and weak to be working in this weather. Let me handle your flyer. You can take my stopping freight so you can have nice rest periods along the route." New York looked sideways at Governor. "You're not that much older than him, you know." "It was not anywhere near that cold," Yonah said, much to Governor's dismay. "The slow freight will be even harder," Minnesota chimed in. "At least a passenger run will help keep some warmth up, eh?" The weather this winter was accompanied by early morning misty fog and the occasional shower. Many times the ice would collect on the rails and we would find ourselves losing traction and our wheels would slip. I had started one day out of Chattanooga with the southbound flyer. When I arrived at the depot, I saw another engine I hadn't seen before. He was similar to a Rogers locomotive, but had angled cylinders like a Norris. His silver boiler glistened in the February sun. He had a brown and gold cab and brown tender. There were yellow rings on his boiler and a red sandbox with a big star on it.
I've been sent to spread the message. God bless Texas.
I introduced myself. "Well, howdy there, General," the engine replied quite enthusiastically. "My name's Texas. Beautiful place, that is. Cattle and prairie everywhere you look." "I've heard about it," I replied.
"You ought to visit sometime,"
Texas said.
"Well, enough about me. What's your story, friend? Where were you built?"
"I was built in Paterson, New Jersey at the Rogers, Ketchum, and Grosvenor Works."
"Well, put her there, bud,"
the engine exclaimed quite energetically. I looked at him sideways, wondering who was this engine and where did he get that ridiculous accent?
"I know the place. I was built at Danforth Cooking Co. there in Paterson."
"Okay," I replied. "Never heard of them." By this time, Florida had finished arranging the next freight train for Washington to take.
"Well, hello there, youngster,"
Florida addressed Texas.
"Why, what an interesting design there. Makes me think of when my first driver and I was stargaze. We were building this line. At night after work, we would go out and look up at the stars."
Florida began to continue into a story and rambling to no one in particular. Sometimes when he was like this, he would get upset if he realized you were listening. "Don't mind him," I explained. "He was the first engine on this line. He loves to talk to himself, but he sure earned the privilege." "Wow, I see what you mean there, buddy," Texas replied. "He talks more than a drunk spy after a New Year's Eve celebration." I looked at Texas once again. "Have you ever even been to Texas?" I asked. Texas' eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in irritation. "Why, my friend," he continued, "I am named after the great state. I'm as Texan as a longhorn steer riding a tumbleweed." I stared at him and just laughed. I had a train to take. On one particularly cold morning when I got to Kingston, the station master pulled me off the flyer for a priority freight back to Chattanooga. When we reached Ringgold, I was sidelined for President to stop at the station. I could hear him tackling the hill. His exhaust beat chuffing heavily as he fought to find traction. As he crested the hill, he approached the station too fast to be able to stop. His wheels locked up and he slid on the icy rails as the track went downhill and then past the station. As President went down the hill and around the curve out of sight, we could hear President whistle repeatedly. He was now a runaway. "We gotta do something!" I yelled to my crew. I didn't realize yet what my crew was doing. Tony had already pulled the pin on the train and Jeff had slammed the regulator wide open. My wheels spun as we set off for the rescue. Before I realized it, Tony had jumped off the tender and thrown the switch just as Jeff threw the Johnson bar. We started off after President in reverse. As we began to catch up, we were beginning to reach 55 miles an hour. I wasn't used to the speed and I was having trouble keeping balanced on the rails, especially in reverse. I put every ounce of steam I had into my cylinders. I pumped as hard and as ferociously as I could. Tony was feeding wood fiercely as I was consuming wood almost as soon as he could throw it into the firebox.
I can see them!
Jeff yelled out. I called out to my brother, "I'm coming! Hold on!"
Help! I can't stop!
President cried.
I used all my sand trying to climb the hill. No good rotten icy rails.
It almost closed in, and Tony had made his way to the back of my tender. I felt my coupling touch the receiver of the baggage car. As he dropped the pin, I felt myself being pulled by the weight of the train. I heard Tony yell, "Now!" I felt my brakes squeeze hard and my valve gear jam. My wheels began to sting as I felt sand digging into my flanges. Suddenly, my brakes released and Jeff threw the Johnson bar into forward. I yelped as the pain of the pressure to reverse direction on my pistons caused a cramp in my cylinders. My brother was in danger though, and I trusted my crew was doing what was best. Now I put all my strength into pulling against the weight of the train, all the while sand slashing and tearing the surface of my wheels. The coaches, very glad for the help, began to brake with all their might, and the train began to slow. I screamed, "Brake, brother! Brake for all you're worth!" After a long struggle, the train finally stopped just before the Chickamauga Creek Bridge. Tony had already climbed to the cab and he and Jeff were quickly dousing my fire and trying to release the pressure in my boiler. As I felt the steam be released, I lost consciousness. I awoke an hour later. My cylinders were throbbing, my valve gear hurt, and my wheels were absolutely raw. The pain in my flanges was excruciating. I awoke later that evening sitting in a siding at Dalton. President was sitting in front of me. Yona was on the track next to me looking worried.
You're awake!
A voice spoke. I looked around and realized it was President.
You've been out of it for 4 hours. You keep whimpering in your sleep.
As I regained cognizance, I began to feel pain again, but not as bad as it had been.
You really damaged yourself, General,
Yona said.
I'm so sorry, General,
President said, looking very sad.
It's my fault. I should have slowed down sooner.
I looked at President. He was clearly very upset. I realized he was also being genuine.
It's not your fault, brother,
I assured him.
I'm sorry for the way we've talked to you,
he confessed.
Water under the bridge, I replied, trying to smile. Families fight sometimes. After all the horrible things we've said,
President added. I stopped smiling and sternly looked him in the smoke box. "We are still brothers," I told him. President looked up at me and smiled. After a long night of friendly conversation and not sleeping well with all the pain, morning arrived. Texas came to bring us to the works in Atlanta. President had to be loaded on a flat car since his wheels had been flattened from sliding on the rails.
Well, good evening, everybody. I can see you've no to do. Give me your attention and a tale I'll tell to you. You'll never hear the like again till the cows come out to play. I want you all to hear about the day we run away.
Oh, the day, they'll never forget the day. The pension of the pair of us for the day we run away.